My family gave me $7,000, while my siblings got $400,000. Years later, all three abandoned them when they refused more money. But when my parents came begging for forgiveness and financial help, my answer left them broken. I'm 27 years old. I work in construction and design. Basically, I started from the bottom and now I have my own company. And I need to tell this story because what happened in my family screwed me up for years until everything finally took a turn I never expected. I guess I should start at the beginning. Although the truth is, the beginning isn't a specific moment, but rather years and years of slowly realizing that something was wrong, very wrong, with how my parents treated me and my siblings. There are four of us siblings. I mean, we were a big family. And in theory, that should mean we all got more or less the same treatment, right? But no, it definitely wasn't like that. There's Michelle, the oldest, who's like 32 now. Then there's me, then Kevin, who's 25, and finally Hannah at 23. We grew up in a normal house, middle class, nothing extraordinary, but we didn't lack anything essential either. My parents worked, we had our bedrooms, we went to school, everything seemed pretty standard, from the outside. But even since I was a teenager, I started noticing weird things, small details that at first I ignored because I thought maybe I was exaggerating or being paranoid. For example, when Michelle graduated high school, my parents threw her a huge party, like with catering and everything, and then sent her to an Ivy League university, one of those super expensive and prestigious universities. I was like 14 at the time and I thought, well, she's the oldest. It makes sense they'd do something special for her. It didn't really bother me because I was still a kid and didn't fully understand the financial implications of all that. When I graduated a few years later, we had a family dinner at home. Nothing more. My parents said something like they'd already spent a lot on Michelle's party and that I didn't want something that big anyway. Which was kind of true because I was more shy. But it still hurt a little that they didn't even ask me what I wanted. The thing is that after high school, I didn't go to college. It's not that I didn't want to, but my parents basically told me they didn't have money to pay for my college and that if I wanted to go, I'd have to get scholarships or student loans. Michelle at that time was in her second year of that expensive university, and I remember thinking, do they really not have money? Or do they just not have money for me? But anyway, I was 18 and didn't want to cause problems, so I started working in construction with an acquaintance of my dad's. It was hard work, getting up at 5 in the morning, coming back all sore and tired, but I needed the money. I still lived at my parents' house because obviously I couldn't afford to rent anything. Kevin, my younger brother, was always my mom's favorite. That was super obvious. When his turn came to go to college, my parents not only paid for everything, absolutely everything, but they also rented him an apartment near campus because according to them, the dorm wasn't comfortable enough. I was still living in my childhood bedroom at 21, working 12 hours a day, and Kevin had his own paid apartment. You know what I mean? The irony was incredible, but I still didn't say anything because, I don't know, I guess part of me thought that maybe I deserved it somehow, that maybe I wasn't as smart as my siblings or something. Hannah, the youngest, was the apple of my dad's eye. When she went to college, they not only paid her full tuition, but also bought her a new car, like a 2018 Honda Civic or something, so she could go back and forth from campus. I drove a 2005 truck that I'd bought myself with my savings, and that broke down every 2 months. But again, I swallowed the frustration because I thought that eventually things would balance out, that maybe when I was more established, my parents would help me with something. Fast forward like 3 years, I was 24 and had finally saved enough to rent a small apartment and start my own design and construction business. I'd learned a lot working for others and felt it was time to try it on my own. I asked my parents if they could help me with something, even just a small loan to buy tools and equipment, because what I had was very basic, and if I wanted to compete, I needed better stuff. My dad told me he could give me $7,000, but that was all they had available, and to see it as a gift, not a loan. $7,000 sounded good at the time, honestly, so I accepted super grateful and bought what I needed. Things were going relatively well. I mean, my business started growing slowly. I was getting jobs here and there. I wasn't getting rich, but I wasn't starving either. Michelle, meanwhile, got married to a guy she met in college, someone from a family with money, and my parents threw her a wedding that must have cost a fortune. I went to the wedding rehearsal. They didn't even invite me to the rehearsal dinner, just the rehearsal because they needed me to help move some. And I heard my mom talking to someone about how much they were spending. She said something like the wedding was costing close to $200,000, but that Michelle only gets married once, and it was worth it. $200,000. I dropped the box I was carrying and just stood there like an idiot trying to process that number. Over the next few months, I started paying more attention to family conversations, especially when we got together for dinners or birthdays. Kevin graduated from college and decided to do graduate school, and my parents casually mentioned they were going to pay for everything, plus his apartment rent, because grad school was very demanding, and they didn't want Kevin to have to work while studying. Hannah graduated too, and turns out she had like $30,000 in student loans, but my parents paid them all off in one lump sum so she could start her professional life without debt. The family dinner that basically changed. Everything happened like 2 years ago, when I was 25. It was a normal Sunday. We were all at my parents' house eating lasagna or something, and somehow the conversation turned to finances and family help. Michelle was talking about how she and her husband were thinking of buying a bigger house, and my mom said something like, "Well, you guys have a good financial cushion after everything we gave you for the wedding and the down payment on your first house." I knew about the wedding, obviously, but down payment on a house? Turns out my parents had also given them like $50,000 for the down payment on their first house. Kevin mentioned he was super grateful because without my parents' help, he'd still be paying off college, and Hannah said something about how lucky she felt not to have student debt like her friends. I was sitting there, with my fork in my hand, and something inside me just exploded. Not in a violent way or anything, but more like a sudden and painful clarity that throughout my adult life I'd been treated like the son who didn't matter as much. I put down the fork and asked, like very calmly at first, "Hey Dad, how much exactly have you given Michelle in total?" My dad got uncomfortable and said that wasn't appropriate dinner conversation, but I insisted. Michelle answered for him, like it was no big deal, and said that between college, the wedding, the house down payment, and other expenses, it had probably been around $200,000, maybe a little more. I asked Kevin how much he'd received. He looked at my parents like asking permission to answer and then said that full college, grad school, rent for 6 years, plus a car they bought him when he graduated from grad school, probably added up to like $150,000 or so. Hannah said she'd received less, only like $80,000 if you counted college, the loans they paid, and the car. I did the mental math quickly, and it was over $400,000 total, among the three of them. 400,000 damn dollars. Then I asked, and what did I get? Because honestly, I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it out loud. My mom said, "Andrew, honey, we gave you $7,000 for your business, $7,000. They'd given my siblings over $400,000, and they'd given me $7,000. I couldn't help it. I started laughing. Like that bitter, kind of hysterical laugh, when something is so absurd, you can't process it any other way. I told them that basically they'd decided I was worth 1.7% of what my siblings were worth. That was the simple math. Michelle tried to say it wasn't like that the situations were different, that I'd chosen not to go to college. But I interrupted her and told her I didn't choose shit. They told me there was no money for my college while paying for her expensive Ivy League. My dad got angry and said I was being ungrateful, that they'd raised all of us, and we never lacked food or shelter, and that what they decided to do with their money was their decision. He was technically right, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I told him that Michelle had everything handed to her on a silver platter, a $200,000 wedding when there are people who don't even make that in 5 years. That Kevin had literally lived like a king throughout his entire college education without having to work a single day. That Hannah had her tuition paid and her debts eliminated. And that I had to wake up at 5 in the morning for years, break my back in construction, drive a beat-up truck, live in a crappy apartment, and make do with 7,000 measly dollars. Kevin tried to defend my parents, saying they'd done the best they could, and that maybe I should be happy with what I had instead of comparing. That made me even angrier, because Kevin had literally never had to struggle for anything in his life. Everything had been given to him, and there he was telling me I should be grateful for scraps. I told them, You have no idea what it's like to wonder if you're going to be able to pay rent next month, or eat ramen for weeks because you need to save to fix your truck, or watch your siblings buy houses and new cars while you're barely surviving. I told them they'd received everything they wanted without having to earn it, and that's probably why none of them had really achieved anything impressive with their lives, because they'd never learned to fight. That caused total chaos. Michelle started crying, saying I was bitter and resentful. Kevin told me I was jealous. Hannah stayed quiet but looked super uncomfortable. My dad got up from the table and told me if I was going to come to his house to insult the family, then I should leave. I said perfect. This was the last thing I needed to confirm anyway, that I really never mattered to them as much as they did. I grabbed my keys and left, slamming the door. I drove to a park nearby and stayed there sitting in my truck for hours, literally until it got dark. I couldn't stop thinking about all the moments in my life where I'd felt something was wrong, but had convinced myself I was exaggerating. All the times they told me there was no money while clearly there was, just not for me. All the times I saw my siblings receive incredible things while I worked myself to exhaustion. I felt like an idiot for taking so long to see the obvious, but I also felt validated because I finally knew I wasn't crazy, that I really had been treated differently, and it wasn't my imagination. Over the next few days, I didn't talk to anyone in my family. Michelle sent me like 10 messages saying I'd overreacted and should apologize. Kevin called to tell me I'd ruined a nice family dinner with my drama. Hannah sent me a short message saying she understood why I was angry, but attacking everyone hadn't helped. My parents didn't contact me at all. Not a call, not a message, nothing. That hurt, more than I want to admit, because deep down, I still expected that maybe they'd realize they'd been unfair and reach out to talk. But no. Apparently, I was the problem for having pointed out the inequality. But here's where things get interesting. I'm not the type to just sit around crying and feeling like a victim forever. I mean, I was angry and hurt, but I also thought, you know what? I'm going to use this as fuel. I spent like a whole week gathering information, reviewing old emails, text messages, my own bank records where I could see my own expenses and sacrifices, anything that could document the disparity. I made a kind of presentation, like with Excel and everything, comparing what each sibling had received. I put screenshots of conversations where my parents mentioned expenses for the others. I made graphs showing the difference, and I'm not gonna lie, seeing it all together visually was even more shocking than just knowing it. The next family gathering was Hannah's birthday like 2 weeks later. I wasn't going to go originally, but then I thought, you know what? This is perfect. I need everyone to see exactly what I'm talking about, because apparently my words weren't enough. So I went, arrived a little late when everyone was already there, eating cake. I pulled out my laptop, which, by the way, I'd bought myself with my own money after saving for months, and told them I needed to show them something. My dad immediately got defensive and said if I was going to start with the same thing as last time, I should leave. But I told them, just give me 10 minutes, and then I'd leave if they wanted. Michelle sighed very dramatically but said fine. I connected my laptop to my parents' TV and started showing them the presentation. I had everything, every expense documented, emails where my parents promised to pay for things for the others, messages where I asked for help and they told me they couldn't. I showed the exact figures. The comparison graph, where you could clearly see I'd received less than 2% of what my siblings had received, combined. I also included my own expenses. How much I'd paid in rent, food, keeping my truck running, tools and equipment, showing I'd spent over $50,000 of my own money on things that for my siblings had been gifts. The silence, when I finished, was incredible. No one knew what to say. Hannah looked genuinely guilty. I think she really hadn't realized how big the difference was because, well, when you're the one receiving everything, you don't pay attention to what others aren't receiving. Kevin looked uncomfortable but still kind of defensive. Michelle just wasn't looking at me. My parents? My mom was crying a little, and my dad looked angry. Like with that red face he gets when he's about to explode but is trying to contain himself. Finally, my dad said, I'd done all this show to make them look bad, that I was embarrassing them in front of the family. I told him no, that I'd done this so everyone would understand. I wasn't exaggerating or being dramatic, that the numbers don't lie, and I'd been objectively treated as less important than my siblings. My mom said they'd done the best they could with the resources they had at each moment, that when Michelle went to college they were earning more money, that circumstances had been different. I pointed out that the different circumstances had lasted over 10 years and covered 3 siblings but magically hadn't covered me. Kevin said something about how maybe they'd made mistakes, but at the end of the day we'd all turned out fine, that I had my business and was doing well. So what was the problem? That made me laugh again because he was basically saying that since I'd managed to survive despite the lack of help, then it didn't matter they hadn't helped me. I told him that was like pushing someone into the ocean and then when they managed to swim to shore, telling them, "See? I knew you could do it. So there's no problem." Hannah finally spoke and said she didn't know things had been so unequal, that if she'd known, maybe she would have said something. I appreciated that, honestly. But I also told her she had eyes and ears, that everyone had seen what my life was like compared to theirs, and that maybe the reason they hadn't said anything was because it was convenient not to notice. Michelle said I was being unfair, that they weren't responsible for our parents' decisions. She was technically right, but I also told them they'd accepted all that money without questioning why I wasn't receiving the same, that they'd never defended me or asked our parents why they treated me differently. My dad finally lost his patience and told me if I was so dissatisfied with what they'd given me, then maybe I should just walk away from the family, that obviously being around them made me miserable. I stared at him for a moment, waiting for my mom to say something, to intervene, to say no, don't say that, but she just kept crying quietly. Kevin and Michelle didn't say anything either. Hannah looked at me, but didn't say anything either. So I told them, "All right, if that's what you want." I closed my laptop, put it in my backpack, and told them they'd basically made it clear to me for years that I wasn't as important to them as my siblings, and that they'd just officially confirmed it. I told them, don't look for me, that I wouldn't look for them either, and that I hoped the over $400,000 they invested in my siblings would give them the grandchildren and happy family they apparently wanted, because I wouldn't be part of that anymore. I left that house and honestly felt a weird mix of freedom and absolute pain. It was liberating in a sense, because I'd finally said everything I needed to say, shown all the evidence, and established a clear boundary. But it also hurt like hell, because deep down, very deep down, I think I always hoped that eventually things would change, that my parents would realize and try to make up for it, but it became clear that was never going to happen. The next few months were weird. At first, I expected someone to contact me, for there to be some attempt at reconciliation, or at least a real conversation about everything that had come to light, but nothing, total silence. I focused completely on my business, working like crazy, accepting all the projects I could, reinvesting everything to grow the company. It was easier to work 16 hours a day than sit and think about the whole family situation, so that's what I did. Like 2 years passed. I was 27 by that point and my business had grown quite a bit. I already had 5 employees working for me. We were doing big projects, making good money. I moved to a much better apartment, bought a new truck for the business. Basically, I was living a completely different life from when everything exploded with my family. I dated a few girls here and there, but nothing serious. Honestly, I was so focused on work, I didn't have much time for personal life. Then one day I got a call from my mom. I hadn't talked to her in literally 2 years, and seeing her name on my phone gave me like a knot in my stomach. I almost didn't answer, but something made me do it. She sounded weird, like nervous and sad at the same time. She asked me how I was, if we could meet for coffee. I asked her why, what had happened. She said she just wanted to talk, that a lot had happened, and she needed to tell me. Part of me wanted to say no, that I didn't care anymore. But another part of me, that part that never left despite everything, needed to know what was going on. We agreed to meet at a neutral cafe, not near her house or mine. When I arrived, both my parents were there, not just my mom. They looked older, honestly, like the last 2 years had hit them all at once. We sat down and there was an uncomfortable silence for a while until my dad finally spoke. He told me they had to tell me something, that things had changed a lot since the last time we saw each other. Turns out Michelle, Kevin, and Hannah had basically all cut contact with my parents too. Michelle first, like 6 months after I left. Apparently, she had problems with her husband, and when she asked my parents to lend her money to pay for a divorce lawyer, they told her they couldn't, that they'd already given her too much, and she was an adult and needed to solve her own problems. She got very angry and stopped talking to them. Kevin, after, when he finished his grad school, and my parents told him they weren't going to pay his rent anymore, that he was already 27 with a graduate degree and should be able to support himself. He got offended and also cut contact. Hannah was the last. When she started having problems at work and asked to borrow money to pay for her car because she was behind on payments, and my parents told her no, that they'd already done enough. Basically, my siblings had been raised expecting my parents would always be there to solve their financial problems. And when my parents finally set boundaries, probably because they didn't have as much money anymore after spending hundreds of thousands on them, none of them knew how to handle it, and they all walked away upset. The irony was almost comical. Me, who left because they gave me so little, they left because they stopped getting more. My mom told me they'd realized they'd made a mistake with me, that they'd been unfair, and that they were very sorry. She said they now understood that by giving everything to my siblings, they'd actually done them no favors because they never learned to fend for themselves, and that I, despite receiving almost nothing, had built something real and sustainable. My dad added, they were proud of me, of what I'd achieved, and hoped we could rebuild some kind of relationship. I listened to them without interrupting. When they finished, I stayed quiet for a while, just drinking my coffee and thinking. Finally, I told them. I appreciated that they admitted their mistakes. That was more than I expected, honestly, but they needed to understand something. I told them that for years I'd needed their support, not just financial, but emotional, that I'd needed them to see me as equal to my siblings, and they'd chosen not to. I told them that now that my siblings had abandoned them, and I was the only one who'd turned out well, suddenly they remembered me and wanted to reconnect. My dad tried to say it wasn't like that they'd thought about me all this time, but I stopped him. I told him if they'd really thought about me, they would have reached out at some point during the last 2 years. I asked them directly if the reason they were looking for me now had anything to do with money, if they needed financial help now that none of my siblings were there. The silence that followed gave me the answer. My mom started to say something about how they were having problems, that retirement wasn't what they expected, but I didn't want to hear anymore. I told them I understood the situation, that I didn't hate them or anything like that, but I didn't owe them anything either. I told them I'd built my life without their help, that I'd learned not to need them, and they couldn't expect that now that I was doing well, I'd be there for them when they were never really there for me. My mom started crying again, and my dad looked between angry and sad. I told them we could maybe keep minimal contact, birthday wishes and that, but not to expect me to be their safety net now that everyone else had left. I got up to leave, and my mom grabbed my hand and said please, that she didn't want to lose me too. I told her that was something they should have thought about many years ago. I gave them my updated number in case there was any real emergency, but made it clear I wasn't going to be sending money or becoming their main support just because they'd finally ended up alone. It's been like 3 months since that meeting. They've called me a couple times. Awkward and superficial conversations where they talk about the weather and ask how the business is going. I don't tell them much because I know part of them is evaluating whether I can help them financially or not. It's sad in a way because I never wanted things to end like this, but there's also something poetically just about all of this, you know? My siblings who got everything and never had to struggle are now struggling and don't know how to handle it. My parents who invested everything in them are now alone because none of them learned the value of relationships beyond money. As for me, I keep building my business, keep living my life. Sometimes I wonder if I should be more generous, if I should help my parents now that I can. But then I remember all those mornings waking up at 5, all those nights eating ramen, all the frustration of watching my siblings receive everything while I broke my back, for scraps. And honestly, I don't owe them anything. I made my life in spite of them, not thanks to them, and that's something nobody can take away from me. I don't know if this makes me a bad person. Sometimes I feel guilty for not being more available to my parents now that they need me. But other times I think, where were they when I needed them? Why do I have to be the son who forgives and forgets when they never gave me the same consideration as the others? I guess I'm still processing everything. That maybe with time my perspective will change. Or maybe not. For now, I'm fine with keeping things as they are, with that minimal and cordial but distant contact. My life is good. My business is doing well. And for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm building something that's genuinely mine, without owing anything to anyone. And that, after everything, is enough.